Obviously, you know what this stuff was all about, right? It's not a surprise that we showed up tonight.
Almost overnight, she went from a possible witness to a person of interest in the case of a missing mom of 5 from New Canaan.
We see state police, New Canaan police, searching downtown Hartford.
So what's that about? Why is the scene moved to Hartford?
You need to tell us what you know about Jennifer's murder and Forrest Dulles.
The girlfriend in the middle of a bitter and brutal divorce battle.
Stuff you were throwing out, we have. And it's all Jennifer. It belongs to Jennifer. Do you understand?
Turned high-profile murder investigation.
Guys, what happened to Jennifer, Michelle? You're gonna do the right thing, Michelle?
We're taking you inside the trial of Michelle Troconis.
And thanks for joining us once again for Inside the Trial of Michelle Troconis. I'm Shannon Miller. We are getting you ready for day 16 of this high-profile criminal trial in Stamford. We left off with forensics, and that is where we expect to begin today as well. On Thursday, retired forensic examiner Christine Roy once again held up bloody evidence for the jury. That clothing, the striped shirt and bra, we now know for certain had blood on it, but we're still waiting to hear about DNA. A lot of the evidence wasn't tested in a way that confirms the presence of human blood. We'll break down that detailed testimony coming up. Michelle Troconis listening intently in the courtroom during Thursday's testimony. Her name was only brought up once when her attorney John Schoenhorn asked a parenting supervisor assigned to observe Forrest Dulles if she'd ever seen his client Michelle Troconis, which she replied no. NBC Connecticut's Kevin Geis joining us once again live outside Stamford Superior Court. And Kevin, we have heard about the presumptive test, blood test, and fingerprints. Are we going to finally hear about DNA testing done on a lot of that Albany Avenue evidence?
Yeah, Shannon, good morning. It's definitely possible. We're wrapping up the week with more forensics testimony after we've already heard extensive forensic testimony about some of the items that were pulled from various scenes in this case. The jury once again shown graphic evidence, and they heard testimony about the items from a retired member of the state forensic lab, Christine Roy. She explained to the jury the process of testing for blood and sampling for DNA. She was responsible for confirming blood and sending samples for DNA testing to confirm whose DNA was on that evidence. Here's what she had to say about processing the cut Vineyard Vines striped shirt investigators say was found in the trash bags dumped along Albany Avenue.
When you took your cutting, what were the steps that you took with that particular cutting?
I tested this area first with the chemical screening test for blood, and it was positive. And then I took a sample right here. First I photographed the shirt, and then I photographed this area. Then I photographed it where I took my cutting. I photographed the cutting, and then I photographed the portion that I was sending to DNA.
And did you eventually also do a confirmatory blood test on that particular sample?
Yes, I did the glycophorin A test, and it was positive, so therefore I could say human blood was detected.
Roy also tested the cut bra covered in a blood-like stain and confirmed the substance was human blood. She showed the jury how the evidence looked when it was received by the lab.
This would be how it would be worn, typically.
And just for the record, Ms. Roy, you are holding together two pieces of one bra at the center front of the bra, is that correct?
Correct.
And so this bra, similar to the shirt, was damaged when you received it, is that right?
Yes, there was this area of damage right between the two cup areas.
Roy also described what were called cuttings, how she pulled that out of some of the evidence. They were small samples covered in a blood-like substance that were sent over to the lab for more DNA testing. We're expecting a little more testimony on some of this evidence today.
Boy, just again, another heavy moment there in the courtroom. Again, Kevin, the jury learned that testing for blood is the just one step in the process. Testing for DNA is a whole other area of the laboratory. The jury has yet to hear about evidence we know was consistent with Jennifer Dulles' DNA. That is the bloody striped shirt and bra, which you mentioned. You can see them highlighted here on the arrest warrant for Michelle Troconis. There was another confirmatory blood test on an item we haven't heard about until now.
Yes, that was a white hardish-like material with some reddish-brown staining on it.
Now, the witness in the prosecution didn't elaborate on what that hard white material was, but Roy testified that she first took a screening test for blood, which was positive, and she did a confirmatory test, which also indicated human blood. Well, she sent swabbings off to be tested then for DNA. So, Kevin, we have talked about how some of the evidence that we're seeing in the courtroom was not mentioned in the arrest warrants. This is one of them. Do we know anything else about this piece of evidence?
Not really. We're expecting to hear a little bit more about this white, hardish object. We know it was pulled from one of the batches along Albany Avenue in Hartford, but it's unclear exactly what it is or exactly why it was of interest to investigators. And at this point, we're still trying to determine exactly when the prosecutors are going to elaborate a little bit more exactly what this item is.
And we're looking to hear more from Brian Foley later on in the show, exactly more on what that item could be. Another piece of evidence, Kevin, that had some of the most blood-like staining on it was, again, that white bath towel found along Albany Avenue. Roy did a screening test on it, which was positive, but a screening test doesn't confirm the presence of blood. A cutting of this towel was also collected and sent for DNA testing. Now, Roy was also responsible for doing some testing on those 4 zip ties taken from the garbage bags along Albany Avenue. She says 2 of them had a lot of the reddish brown stain on them. She did a screening test for blood on those, and they tested positive. She also swabbed the zip ties for DNA, which we are now awaiting testimony on, but we know from the warrant they were consistent with Jennifer's DNA. Another item processed by Roy was a knotted garbage bag that was found with the blood-stained shirt and bra. She explained how she took swabbings for DNA from this bag.
So I loosened that knotted area and I tried to swab the interior of the knotted area. And I designated that swabbing 41-3S2.
And can you tell the jury why you decided to swab the knotted area?
Because the interior of it would be protected from, say, any other damage, or it would maybe have the DNA or biological material of the person that may have handled that area when they knotted it.
Now, this analyst also did testing on the altered license plates that were found in a FedEx envelope removed from a sewer on Albany Avenue, which investigators allege Fotis Dulos dumped there. Lab received the plates the way they were when they were taken out of the sewer, with the taped letters and numbers intact. One by one, Roy removed the pieces of tape and then swabbed each piece on both sides. It wasn't just the Albany Avenue evidence the witness testified about. We also heard about some evidence from the Toyota Tacoma. Roy testified about testing she did on a license plate on it, 2 screws and washers taken off the Tacoma. She says she took swabbings to try to find touch DNA. She didn't see any biological material or staining on the plates or screws. The door panel removed from the Tacoma was also tested in the lab. Roy says she took apart some pieces of the panel, including the switches and the speakers, to swab for DNA. She also tested a number of areas which you can see marked in this photo with a screening test for blood.
I had information that this door was shown to be positive luminol. So what I wanted to test was whether any of those swabbings would have a positive result with the screening test for blood.
Now, you heard about that luminol test on yesterday's show. Roy testified that she got 1 positive and a couple of weak positive results on the screening test for blood. She didn't say anything about confirmatory tests. Also worth noting, Roy said some cleaning products could interact with that screening test. So, Kevin, Attorney John Schoenhorn insists no blood was found in the Tacoma. These were just screening tests, and they do not confirm the presence of human blood. But that begs the question, why wasn't a confirmatory test done on many of the samples? Here is what the expert had to say when asked about this by Schoenhorn.
Are you saying that by testing it for a confirmatory test, you're diminishing the amount of whatever the item is, which makes it more difficult to make the determination of the number or the individuals in DNA? Is that a fair way to put it?
I'm saying that I don't know if it will but I don't want to reduce the amount that's going forward, because I don't know what that result is down the line. So a lot of these swabs, I just going by the color of them, grayish, brownish, reddish brown. So I am going to forward them where they will get the most information out of those swabs.
Okay, so Kevin, let's talk more about that part. It seems like there is some real strategy when it comes to conserving these swabs and preserving them, so to speak, the areas that they can actually perform that testing on, right?
Right. Testimony through sort of that section got a little dense, but sort of in simple terms, Roy described some of this evidence as precious. That was the exact word that she used. So basically what she was trying to say there was that some of these samples are important, and it makes more sense to have it go through for DNA testing, because the DNA testing would be a more important result for prosecutors and for investigators. So ultimately, she said it wasn't worth sort of confirming for blood when they could confirm for DNA, which would ultimately be more important to investigators and ultimately prosecutors here in court.
Yeah, we saw plenty of evidence Thursday, Kevin, that had the positive screening test, but were not confirmed for blood. It's unclear at this point what will be found DNA-wise. Attorney John Schoenhorn bringing up once again, honing in on relevant forensic evidence.
Let's say there were 100 items and 85 of them were found to offer no evidentiary value. I don't think we would need to have the jury having to take all of that in. Not only is it confusing, it's not material to the case any more than if they called 15 witnesses to a crime to say, we didn't see anything. And so I put it under the rule of evidence about cumulative waste of time. There are things that are just delaying and making things go a lot longer.
Anticipating the attack on the thoroughness of the investigation, the court sees the necessity of the preemptive strike on that traditional approach.
Now, Schoenhorn expressing concern about how much the jury needs to take in a month. He asked that testimony about negative tests be limited. Judge Kevin Randolph had this to say about the prosecution's strategy.
Just to use a musical analogy, if the state wants to use 4 quarter notes per bar instead of 1/8 notes or 16th notes, the court is not going to interfere with its style.
Now, the defense and the prosecution did come to an agreement to limit some testimony, including a set of keys found that were later tested for DNA and produced a negative result. So, Kevin, it's a point the defense has been making throughout this trial. There is a mountain of evidence, and not all of it is going to have blood on it or DNA on it. But the prosecution is making a case for a thorough police investigation in this, right?
Right, they're making the point that police spent a lot of time, the forensics lab spent a lot of time going through all this evidence, trying to determine exactly what was blood, what was possibly blood, what wasn't blood, as well as what ended up being tested for DNA, what the results of that were. So we're expecting a lot of testimony still from forensics experts, but it takes a while. So the defense does have sort of a case here to try to speed things up. And you can even tell that Judge Kevin Randolph wants to make sure that the pace is continuing at a reasonable forward movement so that the jury ultimately doesn't get too lost.
And Kevin, it wasn't all forensics on Thursday. We started with testimony from the parenting supervisor who was at Jennifer's Wells Lane home in New Canaan when Fotis had that scheduled visit with the kids. This was just 2 days before Jennifer's disappearance. Sydney Streeter testified Fotis never entered the home and never made any sort of direct physical contact with Jennifer. She described Jennifer and Fotis's interaction as amicable.
He had candy, he had chocolate bunnies for the children.
And was there any interaction between him and Jennifer with respect to the candy?
Yes, when Fotis pulled out the chocolate bunnies and offered it to the children, Jennifer expressed that she eats chocolate every day. So Fotis said, you know, maybe one of the children would like to sacrifice the chocolate bunny, one of their chocolate bunnies for you. And he ripped off a piece of one of them and gave it to Jennifer.
Did you see her eat it?
I did.
Were there interaction at that time Well, how would you describe it?
It was pretty amicable.
Okay. Did they shake hands?
No.
Did they hug each other?
No.
Did they touch in any way?
No.
Kevin, this is the first time since the nanny's testimony that jurors heard about this visit. We now know that that would be the last time that the kids had both of their parents together in the same place. We had heard more details about that court-ordered rules laid out for when Fotis was at Jennifer's property, right?
We did, yeah. So we understand that there had to be sort of a court supervisor or a designated supervisor the entire time, and he was not allowed to be anywhere inside the home or go near the home, essentially. So we know that he was there on the 22nd, but ultimately the prosecutors were trying to make the point that he had no reason and was at no time inside the home and never should have approached the home. And it was ultimately the kids that were sort of doing some of the shuttling of food and different things from inside the house out to Fotis Dulos when Jennifer Dulos was home, or even when she wasn't home. So they were making the point that there was supervision the entire time he was there on the 22nd. So no stone was left unturned on that one.
All right, Kevin, thanks for that. You've learned that there will be more forensics testimony today. Exactly what kind of testimony that is, we'll have to wait and see. We'll let you get inside to the courtroom. Much more to come on Inside the Trial of Michelle Troconis. Coming up, we will talk about the evidence presented to the jury so far with former spokesperson for the state police commissioner, Brian Foley, and more of what his take is on that testimony presented yesterday. And welcome back to Inside the Trial of Michelle Troconis. We are joined once again by one of our analysts throughout the trial, Brian Foley, who at the time of Jennifer Dulos' investigation was the spokesperson for the state police commissioner. Brian, thanks so much for being back with us. The jury again saw all of that evidence seized on Albany Avenue, once again, including Jennifer's bloody T-shirt, Jennifer's bloody bra. We've been waiting to hear again the significance of all of this. We're starting to get into some of that information with the blood experts saying, yes, indeed, this was blood. I want to just talk about the forensics part of that. This is detectives who collected all of this evidence, and for the first time hearing about a new piece of evidence that they submitted as well, right?
Yeah, so look at this is blood evidence coming into the lab, and it's going to this tech Roy that did all the preliminary testing. This is a buildup. It's a chain of custody once it goes into a lab, and this is the first step, is confirming that it's blood. Look, DNA processing takes time, and it ain't cheap. So the lab wants to make sure that it is blood evidence that they're submitting before they send it forward to DNA testing. And so that's where it is. That tech, that lab, they have certifications. They do it every single day. The process is scientific, and she's doing a great job in explaining that forward. And you can see the defense attorney just trying to pick at anything.
The kind of new piece of white hard material that came down. What did you guys know about that?
Well, so yeah, what would you think it is? You know, without getting too gory, it's either bone or tooth. And I believe the theory was that it's possibly a tooth, and they should be able to test that in the lab and find out, you know, that DNA or what type of calcified material that is. But as a detective, the theory would be that it's a tooth, unfortunately.
And again, maybe more testimony potentially could come on that, but. Again, that was a moment we had not heard about yet.
Yeah, that was kept pretty quiet. Like we had discussed, you didn't know about that, and really the state police did a great job in the lab of keeping that part quiet. But I believe at that time they didn't know what it is, and I still don't. I left before the results had come forward on it.
Much of the testimony earlier this week focused on, we're talking about looking at hundreds of hours potentially worth of surveillance video, residential surveillance video along the Merritt Parkway. What kind of a process is that like for investigators?
Huge pain, but you know, the state police is probably the best placed people to do that, because think about just me coming in here this morning, how many times I came across video. But there's video now at state locations, state highways, state rest stops, so they have cameras. Certain municipalities have cameras, so they can start peeling back from there. It is just so time consuming, you know, especially when the recorders aren't synced up, and you know, you got the store that doesn't keep the date and time up, and you kind of have to go through it manually. And the state's cameras are usually pretty dialed in, so you can zero in on a date and time. But it's a pain for the investigators to have to dig through all of that video and just keep going back along the way, and it's a long way on the other side of the state. So they really did a thorough job.
Much more to come from Brian Foley. Coming up again, we're going to talk more about investigators' first interaction with Fotis Dulos' employee, Pavel Gumiene. What investigators thought about his response when he saw them. Welcome back to Inside the Trial of Michelle Troconis. Brian Foley here with us once again. I want to talk now, Brian, about this first interaction that investigators had with project manager for Fotis Dulos, Pavel Gumiene. He happens to time out his arrival at the Jefferson Crossing property the first time that investigators are looking to serve those search and seizure warrants. There was some testimony about his demeanor or what investigators notice about him, right?
So look, cops are curious. Cops are watching everything, especially these major crimes detectives. They've taken interrogation classes, advanced interrogation classes. They're reading body language, and we've talked about this. We start reading everything you're doing, everything. Look, it's not going to build anything towards probable cause, but you're starting to build a foundation. It raises your suspicion. How would a normal person, an average person, respond to this situation? And is that person acting outside of that normal average response? And that gets the detectives' antennas up. They are watching everything, the way he walks, the way he talks, his eye movements, his hand movements, everything they're watching and reading it and trying to process what they're seeing here and what direction they need to advance in. And
we later learned that that's when he had just taken those Porsche Cayenne seats and eventually was going to replace them because Fotis Dulos was on him to replace those. How about later on that night at the State Police Barracks when Fotis and Michelle are first asked to come and give over their DNA, their fingerprints? There was a moment where Michelle Troconis glares at Fotis Dulos. He gives her a look back. Investigators picked up on this. They were interested in this kind of interaction between the two of them, right?
By design, a lot of times when you have multiple suspects, sometimes you keep them separated, sometimes you get them together, and it's all by design, and they want to watch and try to gauge the interaction and what's happening. Again, how would an average innocent innocent people respond in those situations? How would someone that's, acting suspiciously respond? I think they got what they were looking for there in the cold responses and this cold stares, the hard stares that you see in that situation. Such a heavy situation. In theory, a loved one has been lost. The mother of your children had been lost. And, that should be a tragic moment. And instead, it's these really rough and scary glares at each other. Something ain't right, and the detectives are picking up on that.
And Detective Clabby even tells Michelle Troconis in her first interview, it looks like he was like staring a hole through your head, and we were worried for your safety. That was a look that was concerning to investigators.
Sure. I mean, look at, they already, at that point, they're getting their fingerprints and DNA. They're already suspects. They're already worried about how dangerous this man is. They're going to be worried about her safety, obviously, and they're going to use that kind of stuff to try to get her to talk. To this point, not successful.
And I believe it was that very next day you got those positive results back on that Albany Avenue evidence. You got the DNA, you got the fingerprints from Michelle and Fotis, and that's when investigators, according to them, had enough probable cause to make those first arrests.
It really started to escalate at that point.
Let's talk more about, it just, you think about it now, that last day, 2 days before Jennifer goes missing, where those kids, for the last time, had both parents in the same place. Fotis Dulos comes to the house, as Sidney Strader testified. He's got a new haircut. The kids are a little surprised by this haircut. They start rubbing his head. What's your take on that? So, as a homicide detective, my take is one of two things. First, he's trying to not have his hair show up at the scene of a crime. So he's going to shave it. Two, or he's trying to make himself look like somebody else that has a shaved head. Both those are possible scenarios here. Here's what I believe as a detective myself. That's a handsome son of a gun. I can say that, that you look at that guy, he's handsome. He's never shaved his head like that before. And, all through your life, you have never shaved your head until there's a murder of your soon-to-be ex-wife. That's terrible for a jury. Criminals don't think about how that looks, your whole entire life beforehand, and now that. And as a cop, right away, you're like, you don't want your hair showing up somewhere, because those detectives would have found it if he had longer hair. And for him to cut it is just completely out of character. Again, probable cause in that? No, but you're certainly building the foundation of what's going on. Now, I'll tie it into Jennifer right now.
wouldn't she ask, as his boyfriend, why did you shave your head? You know, you had this great hair, and now all of a sudden you shaved your head. That's odd. You know, did you take up swimming? What's happening here? So she would know why he shaved his head.
Yeah, and she tells investigators, yeah, he asked me to do it. I didn't think there was anything to it. I have heard from some sources that he didn't like his long hair when it was wet getting into his face when he was water skiing. But again, with photo stylist not here, we can't ask why he decided to shave his head.
Nope, only theory.
Brian, thank you so much, as always. Incredible insight. That wraps up our exclusive Inside the Trial of Michelle Troconis streaming special. You can watch the trial live on our streaming channels when court starts around 10 a.m. every day. We'll continue to have that live coverage as well on NBC Connecticut News at 4. And then be sure to join us back here weekdays at 9 a.m. for more of our in-depth analysis as the trial continues to unfold. Thanks for watching.